I always thought I was just the caregiver invisible in the family, but everything changed when the door closed. When they left, I thought I was taking care of a bedridden man, but right then he stood up, smiled, and said, "Now we begin." I was shocked I couldn't believe my eyes. It was all a terrible lie. They had used me, erased my name from the assets, made me invisible in my own family. But they didn't know I wasn't going to stand still. If you think this is just another typical family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss out on more thrilling and gripping episodes from us. Ava had always been the invisible thread holding her family together, weaving through their lives with quiet precision, ensuring the house ran like a well-oiled machine. At 35, she had become the unsung hero of her own story, but no one noticed. Her existence, while fundamental, was always in the background, never at the forefront. She was the one who woke up before dawn, the one who made coffee before anyone else was even out of bed. She cleaned, cooked, and organized the household with a sense of duty that had slowly eroded any sense of self. But there was no praise, no thanks, and certainly no recognition. Her husband Monroe was busy with his work, climbing the social ladder, and when he wasn't at work, he was focused on their son Mason. Her in-laws Creasa and Sybil were always around, but only when they needed something. The attention was never for her, and she didn't mind. She didn't expect it. It was her role after all, wasn't it? Ava's mind, however, had begun to fray at the edges. It was subtle at first, the way her heart sank when she saw her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. The person who had once been so full of life, who dreamed and laughed freely, had been replaced by someone hollow, someone who existed merely to serve. She had put her needs aside for so long, burying herself in family obligations, until now it was hard to remember who she had been before. But the memory of the woman she used to be before she gave up everything was beginning to resurface. It wasn't as if Ava had never tried to ask for recognition. Every year she'd watch her family leave for vacations and special events, wondering why they never included her. Her presence was essential when it came to maintaining the house, yet she was never part of the celebration, the joy. Always the one left behind. No one even bothered to check in when they were away. The house would become a tomb filled with silence, and her only company was Henry, her father-in-law. Henry, once a dynamic, larger-than-life figure, had suffered a stroke 2 years ago that left him paralyzed. At least that's what they all said. Ava, in her infinite devotion, had taken it upon herself to care for him, to make sure his every need was met. She had become his caretaker, his confidant, the person who fed him, bathed him, and listened to him, even though he never said a word in return. He had no ability to speak. They claimed no movement, just vacant eyes that stared at nothing. But Ava didn't mind. Henry had always been kind to her before his stroke, and his silence didn't bother her as much as it might have anyone else. She found comfort in caring for him, perhaps because it gave her purpose, something to hold on to in the chaotic, cold world of her family. It wasn't unusual for the family to take off on these lavish trips. Ava had grown accustomed to being left behind an invisible presence in their lives. Her absence in their social circles didn't bother her as much as it should. Instead, she busied herself with maintaining the household, taking care of the details they couldn't be bothered with. Each year she dutifully packed their bags, cleaned their rooms, and made sure their life went on without a hitch while they enjoyed their time away. This time was no different. The moment the family gathered to head off to Hawaii for a week-long vacation, Ava felt the same familiar feeling of loneliness wash over her. They all loaded into the car, chatting excitedly about the sun and sand, and Ava stood in the doorway silently watching them leave. Creasa, her mother-in-law, gave her a quick pat on the cheek as she climbed into the back seat. "You'll manage, dear," She said the words patronizing, as if Ava were incapable of anything beyond domestic chores. "You're the best at this, Ava," Sybil added, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We'll leave everything in your capable hands. You know exactly what needs to be done." Ava forced a smile and nodded. The words stung, but she didn't respond. What could she say? She had been doing this for years, feeding Henry, cleaning the house, running errands, and it had become so second nature that it was hard to imagine life any other way. She was part of the background part of the furniture. As the car pulled away, Ava stood still for a moment, watching them disappear down the driveway. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. She turned to face the empty hallways, the rooms she knew all too well. The house felt cold, not just because no one was here, but because she had begun to feel invisible even when they were around. She wasn't a person in her family's eyes. She was a fixture, a tool used when necessary, a servant without a title. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and antiseptic. It was the same smell that had lingered for months, ever since Henry's stroke. Ava slowly walked into the kitchen, her footsteps echoing off the tiled floor. A half-empty container of oatmeal sat on the counter, a tray with a laminated schedule next to it. 8 a.m., meds. 12 p.m., soup. 4:30 p.m., change linens. "Do not forget the sponge bath." It read, the handwriting swirling with the overly ornate flourishes of Sybil's script. Ava stood in front of the schedule for a long time, her eyes tracing the familiar lines. It was like reading a script for a play she had long since memorized. She sighed, running her hands under the water in the sink as she absently rinsed them. The kitchen window gave her a clear view of the backyard, once vibrant with roses and flowers, now reduced to brittle stalks. She had tended to them for years, trimming and watering them in an attempt to make the house feel warm like a home. But no one had ever noticed. The flowers died, and so did the part of her that had once thought that maybe, just maybe, her efforts might be acknowledged. She paused, her gaze landing on the old family portrait hanging on the wall. Everyone was smiling, gathered together in a perfect pose, everyone except her. She was there, of course, but only in the background, holding Mason when he was a baby, the smile on her face, frozen, her arms aching from the weight of a child she had to hold in place, because Sybil had been too tired that day. Ava remembered that moment. She had been there, but not really. She had smiled, but it had been a smile that had cost her her time, her energy, her dignity. The portrait framed in a gold border seemed to mock her now. She had always been there in the background, never included in their celebrations, never invited to the trips or the important moments. Birthdays, graduations, Creasa's retirement party, all of those events had been for everyone else. Ava had never been invited to join. It was always, "You're too valuable here, dear. We need you at home." And each time they left, they took with them the part of her that still hoped to be included. As Ava stood there lost in thought, the hum of the house around her felt like a soundtrack to her loneliness. She knew it would be a quiet week, just like every other. It had always been like this. She would care for Henry, prepare meals, change his linens, and then when the family returned, they would pick up where they left off. But deep inside, Ava felt a stirring, a whisper of something she had long since buried. Something was different this time. Something didn't feel right. She carried the tray of food into Henry's room. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the dim light from the drawn curtains cast the room in an eerie blue glow. The faint sound of medical equipment buzzed in the background, the oxygen tank humming, the heart rate monitor beeping at a steady rhythm. Everything was so clinical, so fake. This wasn't real. It felt like a stage, a set that had been carefully constructed. "Lunch?" she called softly, her voice barely a whisper as she nudged the door open with her foot. "It's chicken and rice." No answer, no movement. Ava stepped further into the room, carefully placing the tray on the bedside table next to Henry's immobile form. His head was turned toward the window, his body stiff and covered with a patchy wool blanket. Ava reached for the spoon ready to feed him, as she had done 100 times before when a low, raspy chuckle echoed from behind her. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It came from Henry. Ava froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, to find Henry sitting upright in bed, his lips curled into a sardonic smile. "Well," he said, his voice gravelly but steady, "every castle needs a maid." Ava watched from the kitchen window as the family SUV slowly pulled out of the driveway. The bright, sunny morning made the empty house feel even colder. The silence of the house settled over her like a thick blanket, the kind that wrapped you in but smothered you at the same time. She waved them off, a polite gesture she had perfected over the years. Creasa Monroe and Sybil all busy with their own lives and dreams. They didn't spare her a second thought as they left for the tropical paradise of Hawaii, as they had done countless times before. Ava didn't mind. Not exactly. There was a strange comfort in this routine, this arrangement, where she was the ever-present caretaker. It was the way things had always been. She was the one who stayed behind, the one who tended to the house to Henry, her father-in-law, while they lived their lives out in the sun and sand. She wasn't part of their world, and she had long since stopped pretending to be. She glanced at the clock, noting that it was still early. The family wouldn't return for at least a week. Ava had grown accustomed to the stillness. She could almost hear the hum of the house settling back into its familiar pattern, its rhythm of emptiness. The first thing she did was head to Henry's room. The man who had once been full of life, full of energy, was now reduced to a shell, a body in a wheelchair. That's what everyone thought. That's what Ava thought. Henry had suffered a massive stroke 2 years ago. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, at least that's what they said. The family had assigned her the task of caring for him, and she had accepted it quietly, without question. The years had slipped by with Ava running the household, taking care of Henry's every need, while the rest of the family lived their lives elsewhere. She thought she was being helpful. She thought she was doing the right thing. But the truth had always been far darker than she could have imagined. Ava stepped into Henry's room as she had done every day. But today, there was a strange sense of anticipation. The air felt charged, as if something was about to change. The curtains were drawn tightly, leaving the room in a dim, almost eerie light. The faint hum of the oxygen tank in the corner was the only sound, a monotonous reminder that Henry was still alive, still breathing, but that was all. His body remained motionless in the bed just as it had for the last 2 years. She placed the tray of food on the bedside table as she always did, and then bent down to adjust the pillow beneath Henry's head. She didn't expect anything. She didn't expect to hear his voice, to see him move, to do anything other than remain as he had been, a prisoner in his own body. She picked up the spoon to feed him, but before she could bring it to his mouth, something happened that made her blood run cold. A low chuckle. Raspy, like gravel being dragged across the floor. It was a sound she had never heard before coming from Henry. Ava froze. The spoon clattered to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. Henry was sitting up. He was smiling, no grinning, his lips curling in a way that sent a chill down her spine. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, now gleamed with something she couldn't quite place. "Well," he said, his voice rough but steady, "every castle needs a maid." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man who hadn't moved in over 2 years, who had been unable to speak, was sitting up talking to her with a smug expression on his face. The spoon fell from her hand, the clink of metal against the floor, the only sound in the room. Ava's mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was he hallucinating? But no, his movements were deliberate, calculated. He wasn't confused. He wasn't delirious. He was completely aware of what was happening. "How?" Ava whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands shaking as she reached for the edge of the dresser to steady herself. Henry chuckled again, this time louder, as if savoring the moment. "How do you think, Ava?" he said, his voice low and almost amused. "Do you really believe that I've been lying here for all this time, incapable of moving, incapable of speaking? That was just the story they fed you." Ava's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to make sense of the words. This couldn't be real. She had spent the last 2 years caring for him, watching over him like a lifeless doll. She had bathed him, fed him, spoken to him, as if he could hear her, as if he could understand her. But now here he was, sitting up in bed, speaking to her like nothing was wrong. "I don't understand," Ava said, her voice trembling. You've been faking it all this time." Henry nodded slowly, his smile widening. "That's right," he said, his eyes glinting with a mixture of satisfaction and something darker. "I've been playing a part, Ava, just like you have." Ava's legs felt weak. She stumbled backward, her mind still processing what she had just heard. Everything she had believed, everything she had been told was a lie. Her hands gripped the edge of the dresser, her knuckles white. "Why?" she asked, barely able to whisper the word. "Why did you do this? Why did they do this?" Henry's expression shifted, the smugness fading into something more serious. "Because they needed you to be their maid, Ava," he said. "They needed someone who would be there to clean up their messes, to take care of everything while they lived their lives oblivious to you. They used you, Ava, and they've been using you for years." Ava's mind was reeling. The family had always treated her like an afterthought, always leaving her behind when they went on trips, when they celebrated special occasions. She had convinced herself that this was the way things were supposed to be, that she was supposed to be the one who stayed behind, the one who kept the house running while they lived their lives. But now, standing in front of Henry, the truth was crashing down on her. She wasn't part of the family. She never had been. She was just the help. Her heart ached as she thought about all the years she had spent giving caring, never once questioning why she was always left behind. All those holidays, all those birthdays, all those family gatherings, she was never invited. She was never seen. But now Henry was telling her everything. The family had orchestrated this entire charade, pretending that Henry was incapacitated, all so they could keep her in the background, out of sight and out of mind. "Why tell me this now?" Ava asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry's eyes softened, a flicker of something like regret crossing his face. "Because, Ava," he said quietly, "you deserve to know the truth. You've been kept in the dark for too long. You've been a pawn in their game, but you don't have to be anymore." The words hit Ava like a slap to the face. She wasn't just a bystander in this story. She had been the one holding it all together, the one who had been fooled into thinking she was doing the right thing, all the while being manipulated by the very people she had loved and trusted. Her chest tightened as she tried to process everything. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation. It all came crashing down at once, and Ava felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away. "What do I do now?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Henry's gaze softened further, and for the first time he seemed genuinely compassionate. "You fight back," he said. "You don't let them erase you any longer. You deserve more than this. Ava stood there frozen, her mind spinning with the implications of Henry's words. Her whole life had been built around serving this family, but now, with the truth laid bare in front of her, everything was different. She wasn't just a caretaker anymore. She wasn't just a maid. She was Ava, and it was time to take control. Ava stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, her breath shallow as she absorbed the shock of Henry's revelation. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, each word he spoke echoing in her mind. She could barely comprehend what had just happened. Henry, the man she had cared for, the man she had thought was helpless, had been playing her all along, and the family, her family, had been complicit. Her head swam with confusion. What did this mean? How long had they been lying to her? Was any of it real? Ava had always believed that the family depended on her, that she was a vital part of their lives. But now, in the wake of Henry's admission, it felt like everything she had ever known was a lie. Her place in the family had never been real. She wasn't their daughter-in-law, their family member, or even their equal. She was their tool, a mere pawn in their twisted game. The weight of the realization settled heavily on her chest. Ava had spent years caring for them, working tirelessly to maintain the household. She had been the one who ensured everything ran smoothly, the house, the bills, the schedules. She had been the one they turned to when they needed something done, when they needed a safe place to hide from the world. And in return they had given her nothing. No recognition, no appreciation, no love. Just silence, indifference, and subtle manipulation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a dim glow, Ava felt a surge of determination rise within her. She couldn't let it end like this. She wouldn't allow herself to be erased from their lives. She needed to know the full extent of what they had done. She needed to see the truth for herself. Ava took a deep breath and turned to leave Henry's room. Her feet felt heavy, her steps slow and deliberate. She made her way to the office, a small, cluttered room at the back of the house where Monroe kept all the important documents. She had never been allowed to touch them before, but now everything was different. The office door creaked as she pushed it open. The room smelled of stale paper and old books, the faint scent of dust hanging in the air. She moved to the filing cabinet in the corner, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled open the top drawer. Inside, she found the usual papers, bills, invoices, contracts. But there, hidden beneath a pile of old receipts, was something different. A folder marked Financial Affairs sat at the bottom of the drawer, its edges worn and yellowed with age. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she pulled it out, her fingers brushing against the edges of the paper. She opened it slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she began to flip through the pages. The first document that caught her eye was a financial statement. It was a summary of the family's assets, their holdings, and their investments. But what made Ava's stomach drop was the list of names at the top of the page. Her name wasn't there. Instead, it was crossed out with a thick black line, and in its place was the name of her husband Monroe and Sybil, his mother. Ava's eyes darted across the page, her pulse quickening. She flipped through more documents, her hands shaking as she uncovered more evidence of her exclusion. One by one, the papers revealed the same pattern. Her name was erased, replaced by someone else's. It was as if she had never existed in the family's financial structure at all. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. For years she had worked tirelessly to ensure that the family's financial affairs ran smoothly, but she had never once been considered a part of it. She had been excluded from every important decision, every major investment. She was invisible to them, a shadow, a ghost who existed only to serve. Ava sat down heavily at the desk, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. She had been so blindly loyal to them, so willing to sacrifice her own life and happiness for their well-being. And this was how they had repaid her, by erasing her, by making her nothing. The bitterness burned in her throat, and for the first time in years, Ava felt the sting of tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But no, she couldn't cry. Not now. Not when she had come this far. Ava wiped the tears away, her resolve hardening. She had to know more. She had to understand the full scope of what they had done. With shaking hands, she pulled open another drawer and began searching through the files inside. It didn't take long before she found something else, an envelope marked Power of Attorney. She hesitated for a moment, her heart thudding in her chest. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the document inside. The power of attorney was not in her name. It was in Monroe's name and Sybil's. The document gave them full control over her finances, her assets, her life. Ava felt a surge of anger rise up within her. This was what they had been doing all along, controlling everything, taking everything while she had been none the wiser. Her hands clenched into fists, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the betrayal. Her entire life had been a lie. They had used her, manipulated her, and now they had stolen everything she had worked for. But Ava was no longer the woman she used to be. She wasn't the quiet, obedient wife who stayed in the background, who did whatever was asked of her without question. She wasn't the woman who had spent years pretending everything was fine, pretending that her life had meaning even when they had treated her like nothing more than a servant. No, Ava was done being invisible. She was done being the family's doormat. She stood up abruptly, her eyes burning with fury. She had to confront them. She had to make them see the truth, make them understand that she wasn't going to stand by and let them erase her any longer. But as she stood there, her mind racing, another thought crossed her mind. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the power they had taken from her. It was about everything. The lies, the manipulation, the deceit. They had built a life on her submission, on her silence. But now it was time to shatter that illusion. Ava clenched the power of attorney document in her hand and walked out of the office, her steps steady, her resolve unshakable. The truth was out now, and she wasn't going to let them keep playing their games. Her family had underestimated her. They had thought she was weak, that she would just go along with whatever they said. But Ava knew better now. She was no longer the maid in their castle. She was the queen, and it was time to take back her throne. As she walked through the darkened halls of the house, the weight of the discovery hung heavy in the air. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never let them get away with it. She would expose them for the frauds they were, and she would take back what was rightfully hers. Ava was ready. The weight of the discovery lingered in Ava's chest like a heavy stone. She had spent days sifting through the files, the documents, and the lies her family had woven around her. The betrayal felt like a cruel joke, one that had been played for years with her as the punchline. But now, standing in the middle of the living room with nothing but the bitter truth to hold on to, Ava made a decision. She was done being their pawn. She was done letting them use her as their scapegoat, their invisible servant. This was no longer just about the lies. It was about her dignity, her life, and her future. She couldn't let them continue to manipulate her any longer. She needed to fight back. She had to make them pay for what they'd done. Ava's mind raced as she moved through the house. Her gaze flickered over the pictures on the walls, the smiling faces of her family frozen in time, unaware of the battle that was about to unfold. The contrast between their happy, fake lives and the mess she had discovered in the office was too much for her to bear. They had made her invisible, but now she would make them see her. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd have to call. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello, Ava. What can I do for you?" It was Sarah, the lawyer, who had helped her with minor legal issues over the years. Ava had always thought of Sarah as a distant acquaintance, someone who was there for formal matters, but never for the deeper ones. But today, Sarah was going to become more than just a lawyer to Ava. She was going to be her ally in the fight for everything she had lost. "I need your help," Ava said, her voice steady but determined. "I need to fight back. I've been taken for a fool, and it's time to make things right." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ava could almost hear the wheels turning in Sarah's head. "Of course I'll help. What's going on?" Ava took a deep breath and began recounting everything she had learned about the family's manipulation, about the power of attorney, about the false documents, and the fact that her name had been erased from everything that mattered. She explained how her own family had systematically excluded her, using her for their convenience, and how Henry had just opened her eyes to the truth. As she spoke, the anger inside her bubbled up, but Ava kept her voice calm. This wasn't about emotion. This was about justice. She needed Sarah's expertise to ensure that the truth would be heard. "I'll gather the necessary documents," Sarah said when Ava finished. "But this isn't going to be easy. They'll have their own legal team, and they won't let you get away with it without a fight." "I'm ready for that fight," Ava replied, her voice firm. "I've spent years fighting for them, doing everything they asked. Now it's my turn." The conversation ended with a plan. Ava was to gather all the evidence she had found and meet with Sarah in 2 days. But as she hung up, a new wave of determination washed over her. This wasn't just about legal documents. This was about reclaiming her life, her identity, and the years she had wasted. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Later that night, Ava sat in her living room, staring at the evidence laid out before her on the coffee table. The papers, the recordings, and the financial statements were all carefully organized, but she still felt like something was missing. What had Henry meant when he said, "You deserve to know the truth"? What was the full story? She stood up and moved to Henry's room. The door creaked as she opened it, and there he was, sitting up in his bed, looking more like the man she had known before the stroke. The surprise she had felt earlier had worn off, and in its place was something colder, a deep curiosity mixed with a hint of anger. Ava hesitated for a moment, then walked in. Henry looked up at her, his eyes sharp as though he had been waiting for her. "Henry," Ava said, her voice low. "I need more. What else have they done? How deep does this go?" Henry's eyes flickered for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to tell her. Then slowly he reached for the small bedside drawer and pulled out a slim, battered envelope. He handed it to her without a word. Ava took it, her fingers brushing against the worn paper. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to it," Henry said, his voice gruff but direct. "It's all there, everything you need to know." Ava opened the envelope and found a small, old-fashioned recorder. She clicked the play button, and immediately a familiar voice filled the room. It was Monroe's voice, smooth and calculated, discussing the family's plans. He spoke about moving assets, securing their future, and most chillingly about making sure Ava was kept in the dark. "She's too loyal to question anything," Monroe's voice said, his tone almost dismissive. "She'll keep doing the work, and we'll keep taking what's ours. She'll never even notice." Ava's blood ran cold as she listened. The audacity, the cruelty. She had been their servant, their invisible worker, and they had known all along that she wouldn't question it. She wasn't just ignored, she had been actively manipulated, kept in the dark so that she could continue serving their purposes. The recording went on, detailing how her name had been erased from legal documents, how they had falsified signatures, and how they planned to strip her of everything she had. Ava hit stop on the recorder, her hand trembling. The reality of what she was hearing was worse than anything she could have imagined. But now she had proof. She had their voices, their lies, their plans. They thought they could control her, but they had underestimated the woman they had so callously overlooked. She turned to Henry, her eyes hard. "I'm going to make them pay," she said, her voice steady now. "They won't get away with this." Henry nodded, his eyes softening for the first time. "Good. You deserve it." The air between them shifted. For the first time, Ava didn't feel like a caretaker, a servant, or a victim. She felt like a woman in control of her own fate. She wasn't just going to let them take everything from her. She was going to take it back. The next few days were a blur of meetings with Sarah, compiling the evidence and preparing for the battle that lay ahead. Ava had to steel herself, reminding herself that this wasn't just a fight for her. It was a fight for her dignity, for her future, for everything she had ever been denied. But as she sifted through the final pieces of evidence, something inside her began to shift. The pain of betrayal, the hurt of years of silence, all began to fuel her determination. She wasn't just fighting for her rights anymore. She was fighting for her freedom, for the chance to rewrite her story. And when the day of the confrontation finally arrived, when she would face her family for the first time, with the truth in her hands, she didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. Ready to take back everything they had stolen from her. Ava wasn't going to be their pawn anymore. She was going to be their reckoning. Ava could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders as she sat alone in her living room. The files and documents spread out before her like a map to a treasure she was determined to find. She had spent hours combing through each page, each contract, each letter that had once seemed so mundane, but now held the key to everything she needed to know. The truth buried beneath years of lies was slowly being uncovered, but it felt like walking through fog. Every step was uncertain. Every discovery felt like it could be the last. Yet there was no turning back now. The recorder Henry had given her had been a catalyst, an undeniable piece of the puzzle that had already begun to shatter the facade her family had built. But Ava knew that recordings alone wouldn't be enough. She needed hard evidence, something undeniable that would force her family to confront what they had done. As the days went by, Ava's investigations deepened. She found herself losing track of time, the hours blurring into one another as she dug deeper into the family's financials. Monroe and Sybil's names appeared again and again on documents, investment deals, property transactions, and most damning of all, documents bearing her name that had been redacted or outright replaced. It felt like each new discovery was a confirmation of the nightmare she had woken up to. In the early hours of one particular morning, she came across something that made her heart drop into her stomach. There it was in black and white, a legal document transferring ownership of her family's assets. The house, the cars, the business investments, all moved into a trust. A trust that she had never signed for. Her name was there all right, but it was crossed out, replaced by Sybil's, then right under that Monroe's signature. Ava's hands trembled as she reread the page. Her name had been crossed out, erased. The very foundation of her life, the things she had worked for, the things she had believed were hers, had been taken away. And worse yet, she hadn't even been consulted. Not once. She had been excluded, manipulated, and made to feel like she didn't matter. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. She had been left out of every decision, every important matter concerning her own life. The assets, the house, the business they had always told her were family property were never really hers. She was a bystander in her own existence. She slammed the document down on the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Ava stood up, pacing back and forth, her thoughts racing. She had been made invisible, erased from her own story. All those years of loyalty, all the sacrifices she had made meant nothing to them. They had used her as a tool, a means to an end. And now she was left holding the broken pieces of a life that wasn't even hers. But Ava wasn't one to back down. The more she uncovered, the stronger her resolve grew. They had thought she was powerless, but she had always been more than they realized. She would make them see that now. Her next step was clear. She needed to confront them. She couldn't let them continue to control the narrative. But the thought of facing them, of sitting across from Monroe and Sybil, made her stomach churn. Every encounter had been a facade, every conversation a manipulation. How would they react when they saw her standing in front of them armed with the truth? Ava's mind raced as she thought about her next move. She had to be strategic. The stakes were higher now than ever before. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Her entire future depended on what happened next. Over the next few days, Ava's anxiety grew. Each meeting with her lawyer, Sarah, left her feeling both empowered and terrified. Sarah was practical sharp and had a clear plan, but Ava knew the emotional weight of this battle would be far harder to handle than the legal one. They would fight back. They would lie. They would manipulate the narrative in ways Ava could not even begin to predict. And then the day came. Ava had gathered everything: documents, recordings, the power of attorney, the legal transfers, and it was time to confront them. She had been preparing herself mentally, but nothing could prepare her for the moment when she would finally face the people who had controlled her life for so long. Ava arrived at the family's office, the one place she had always been told she wasn't allowed to enter unless it was for something necessary. But today, the office felt different. It felt like a battleground. She stood outside the door for a moment, taking a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Inside, Monroe sat at his desk, his back turned to her. Sybil was perched in the armchair nearby, her face a mask of cool indifference. As Ava walked in, the tension in the room became palpable. Both of them looked up, and for a moment Ava saw a flicker of something in their eyes. Was it fear? Or was it the same condescending attitude they had always had? Ava couldn't be sure. "I need to talk to you," Ava said, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched at her sides. Monroe's gaze hardened. "We don't have much time, Ava," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "What's this about?" Ava didn't waste time. She pulled the documents out of her bag and laid them on the desk, watching as their expressions shifted from confusion to alarm. "You've made a lot of decisions without consulting me," Ava said, her voice calm but firm. "And it's time you were held accountable for what you've done." Sybil stood up quickly, her face flushed with anger. "What is this, Ava?" she spat. "You think you can come in here and—" "I think I can come in here and show you exactly what you've done," Ava interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. She slid the documents across the desk. Monroe's eyes flickered over them, but when he saw the legal transfer of assets, his face paled. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, his voice now tight, controlled. But Ava could see the fear in his eyes. "From you," she replied, her voice dripping with icy resolve. "You thought you could erase me. You thought you could take everything from me and make me disappear. But I'm not disappearing anymore, Monroe." Sybil stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to regain control. "We've been doing what's best for the family." "Don't pretend this is about the family," Ava said, her voice rising now. "This was never about me. It was never about us. This was about you and your greed. You've been using me, manipulating me for years, and now it's over." Monroe's composure began to crack, the facade he had so carefully constructed starting to crumble. "Ava, please," he said, his tone shifting from defensive to pleading. "You don't understand. We were just trying to. I understand more than you think. Ava cut him off, stepping forward, her voice strong, unyielding. I understand that you've taken everything from me, my name, my life, my future, and I'm done being the invisible one. I'm done letting you control me. Ava could see the panic now in Sybil's eyes, and she knew that they were realizing too late that they had underestimated her. She wasn't just the housekeeper. She wasn't just the quiet wife who did everything they asked without question. She was Ava, and she was ready to take her life back. You've made a lot of mistakes, Ava said, her voice low and deliberate. But the biggest one was thinking I wouldn't fight back. Ava walked into the room, the heavy weight of the truth pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible hand, but she carried it with newfound strength. She had finally come face to face with the family who had controlled her life for so long. The room was thick with tension as she slid the stack of documents onto the table. Monroe, Sybil, and even Creasa were seated, their faces carefully guarded, but Ava could see the cracks in their composure. Enough of the games. Ava said, her voice steady but full of conviction. She looked at each of them, her gaze piercing through their practiced indifference. I know everything. The lies, the manipulation, the way you've used me. It's all out in the open now, and I want answers. For a moment the room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the house outside. It was a silence that stretched on far too long. Ava could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, but it was Monroe who finally broke the stillness. Ava, he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. You don't understand. We did this for the family, for your future. We've been trying to protect you, to shield you from the truth. You have no idea how hard we've worked to keep everything together. He leaned forward, eyes wide, as if he was trying to make her understand. Ava clenched her fists, fighting the rush of anger that surged through her. No! She cut him off sharply. You've been protecting yourselves, not me. You used me, manipulated me, and now you're trying to make it seem like it's my fault. The words stung more than she cared to admit. The hurt was still there, raw and fresh, and it was hard to push it aside. For so long, Ava had convinced herself that she was a necessary part of their family, that without her things would fall apart. But now she saw the ugly truth. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their game. And Monroe, with his rehearsed words and false sincerity, was still trying to twist it all back on her. Sybil chimed in, her tone dripping with that familiar, condescending sweetness. Ava, darling, you're being emotional. You don't understand the bigger picture. This isn't about you. We've worked so hard to build this family's future, and you've always been there, but you've never seen it. You've never asked the right questions. It was for your own good. For a moment, Ava's mind flickered back to all those years when she had been the dutiful wife. The silent helper, never questioning their decisions, always doing what was expected of her. The thoughts collided in her head, the memories, the betrayals, the pain. But she wasn't going to let them make her feel small again. Not now. Not after everything she had uncovered. I've always been in the background, haven't I? Ava said, her voice a little quieter, but every word sharper than a knife. You never thought I would ask questions. You never thought I would find out. But I did. And now it's your turn to answer to me. Monroe's face twisted with frustration. You're making a mistake, Ava. You're turning on us. You don't know what you're doing. His voice rose in pitch, like he was losing control of the situation, and the mask he had so carefully crafted started to slip. You're not thinking clearly. You can't just turn your back on the family like this. The pressure in the room was palpable. The walls seemed to close in on Ava, the familiar faces of her family suddenly feeling like they were strangers. Her breath came shallow, the anxiety of the moment crawling under her skin. Her body was tense, every nerve on edge, but still she stood her ground. Don't you dare make me feel guilty, Ava said, her voice rising now louder, firmer. You've been lying to me my whole life. Every decision you made, every move you made was for your benefit, not mine. I've spent years working to keep you all happy, to keep this house standing. But I wasn't a part of your plans. I was just a tool. You thought I wouldn't see it. You thought I'd stay in the dark. But now I see everything for what it is. She could feel the heat of the room closing and the weight of her words sinking in deeper with each second. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to jump. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let them win this time. Sybil's eyes narrowed, her lips tight with anger. You're out of line, Ava. We've done everything for you, and this is how you repay us, by making us out to be the villains. Ava shook her head, the sting of Sybil's words not hurting nearly as much as they used to. You've been the villains all along, she said quietly, her gaze unwavering. And I'm done being your victim. Ava could feel herself becoming more distant from them with every word. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. A moment of truth. But the weight of it still felt heavy on her chest. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about reclaiming her life, her identity, her worth. It was about taking back everything they had taken from her. At that moment, she heard the faintest sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the doorway. She turned her head to see Henry standing there, leaning against the frame, his gaze steady. His presence was unexpected, but it felt like a lifeline. She had been so caught up in the storm with her family that she hadn't even noticed Henry's quiet support. Henry gave her a small nod, his eyes full of quiet encouragement. His face was pale, but there was a strength in his gaze that she hadn't noticed before. It was the strength of someone who had been through their own battle, someone who understood what it meant to be manipulated, to be betrayed. And now he was here, standing with her. Don't let them break you, Ava. Henry's voice was raspy but firm. You've got this. You're stronger than they think. His words grounded her, reminding her that this fight wasn't just hers to fight alone. She wasn't just taking on her family. She was standing up for herself, for the woman she had almost forgotten she was. And now she was reminded of her own strength. Ava straightened her shoulders back, her resolve hardening like steel. She looked back at her family, who were clearly beginning to feel the weight of her determination. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever again. You're right, she said, her voice cold now, biting. I'm stronger than you ever gave me credit for. And I'm not going anywhere until you own up to everything you've done. Monroe's eyes flickered with something akin to fear, and Sybil's expression tightened in frustration. The game was changing, and they could see it. Ava wasn't just a woman standing up for her rights. She was someone who had been broken, yes, but had learned to rebuild herself from the pieces. They had underestimated her. Henry, once a man they had confined to a bed, was now a silent partner in her strength, giving her the courage to push through this final confrontation. He wasn't just there as a symbol of her past. He was a symbol of the power she could wield if she just chose to stand up and fight for herself. The silence in the room was thick, but Ava held her ground, unwavering. She had started this journey, and now there was no turning back. She was done being their shadow. The truth had been uncovered, and there was no escaping it. She had taken control, and now her family would face the consequences of their actions. No more hiding, no more silence. It was time for them to pay for what they had done. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of Ava's office, but the warmth felt distant. Ava sat at her desk, papers scattered in front of her like a battlefield. The evidence was there, every document, every recording, every piece of the puzzle that would expose her family's betrayal. Yet, as she stared at it, all her mind kept drifting to the face of Horace, her father-in-law. The man who had always been so aloof, so distant, yet so authoritative in the family. For years, she had seen him as an old man, simply fading away into the background, his life reduced to medical appointments and quiet nights by the fireplace. But what if he wasn't just a casualty of time? What if he was the one pulling the strings all along? Ava leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, as she thought back to the conversation in the office. Henry's words echoed in her mind, still fresh and vivid. "You've been kept in the dark for too long. You've been a pawn in their game, but you don't have to be anymore." Ava had been so focused on Monroe and Sybil, their lies and manipulations, that she hadn't stopped to consider that Horace, once a figure of wisdom and authority, might be the architect of the entire scheme. The thought unsettled her. She hadn't trusted Horace fully, of course, but she never imagined that he could be so deeply involved in the deception. She had always thought of him as a passive figure, a man who was too old to be dangerous, too tired to care about anything other than his own survival. But now everything was in question. What if he had been the one who'd orchestrated her exclusion from the family's wealth? What if he was the one who had manipulated the entire system, using his position to take away everything from her without her even realizing it? Determined to find out the truth, Ava began to dig deeper. She needed more evidence, something concrete to tie Horace to the web of lies her family had built around her. She started with his personal files, things she had never thought to question before. He had always been the patriarch, the revered elder, and so his papers had always been off limits. But now, with nothing left to lose, Ava no longer cared about the boundaries. She had to know what he was hiding. Hours passed as Ava sifted through folders, combing through legal documents and contracts. But then she found an old, worn file that seemed strangely out of place. She opened it slowly, the faint rustle of the paper almost too loud in the quiet room. The document inside was a series of agreements, legal contracts, signatures, dates, and as she read through them, her heart began to race. This wasn't just some family trust or a simple will. These were detailed papers outlining the transfer of assets, ownership of the house, the business, and most damning of all, her inheritance. Her name, once included as a rightful beneficiary, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the documents were signed off by Horace with his unmistakable signature appearing at the bottom of every page. What was even more unsettling was the date. These documents had been signed years ago, long before the family had even considered her as a threat. Horace had arranged for her removal from the inheritance well before Ava had ever suspected. And what was worse, he had done it under the guise of protecting the family's interests, as though his decisions had been made out of love and concern. Ava sat back in her chair, stunned as the full weight of her discovery crashed down on her. Horace had been the one to eliminate her from the family's future, to erase her from the financial narrative that had governed her life for so long. Every gift she had given, every sacrifice she had made, every moment she had spent caring for this family, all of it had been a lie. They had never seen her as family. They had seen her as nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. Her mind swirled with the mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness. But beneath it all, a fire ignited in her chest. She wasn't going to let Horace get away with this. She couldn't. Not after everything she had discovered. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number, the lawyer who had been helping her prepare for this moment. The phone rang twice before Sarah answered. "Ava," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Do you have something?" "I have everything," Ava said, her voice tight with emotion. "I found Horace. He's the one behind all of this. He's the one who removed me from the inheritance. He's been using his power to manipulate everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ava could almost hear Sarah's mind working, processing the new information. "You're sure?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm sure," Ava said, her voice firm. "I found the documents. He signed everything away years ago. He's the one who orchestrated it all. They've all been lying to me." There was a moment of silence before Sarah spoke again. "Okay, this changes things. We need to act fast. This is bigger than we thought. We'll need to gather more evidence, go through his records, and see what we can find. But Ava, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly." Ava closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. She knew this would be a fight not just for her inheritance, but for her sense of self. She had spent so long believing in the family's love, in their shared history. To realize that it was all a lie, that Horace had been the mastermind behind the deceit, was almost too much to bear. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now. As the days passed, Ava threw herself into the investigation. She was relentless, poring over every document, every communication, searching for clues that would further expose the family's lies. The more she found, the more she uncovered about Horace's involvement. It seemed that every decision, every major transaction had been made with his fingerprints all over them. He had set everything in motion, using his influence to ensure that Ava would never have access to what was rightfully hers. But it wasn't just the legal documents that weighed on Ava. It was the emotional toll of it all, the years of loyalty, the sacrifices, the love she had given to a family that never truly saw her. She had been a wife, a daughter-in-law, a caretaker, but to them she had always been a ghost, a shadow in the background. The emotional weight was crushing. Ava found herself fighting not just against the legal battle, but against the ghosts of her past. The memories of holidays spent alone, of never being invited to family gatherings, of always being the one left behind, they all came rushing back. How had she let this happen? How had she allowed herself to be erased for so long? But there was no time for regret. The pieces were falling into place now, and the truth was staring her in the face. Horace had orchestrated everything, and it was time to make him pay. Ava steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. She would fight for what was hers. She would fight for her dignity, her legacy, and the life she had been denied. She wouldn't let Horace or anyone else take that from her. The battle was far from over, but Ava knew one thing for certain. This was her fight now, and she was ready to win. The courtroom was a sea of faces, but Ava's focus was razor sharp. She sat at the table, her fingers clenched around the stack of documents in front of her. Every piece of evidence she had gathered felt like a small victory, but with each passing minute, the pressure to keep it together grew heavier. The family was relentless, and the courtroom with its sterile walls and sharp-eyed lawyers was no place for her to be weak. She couldn't afford to be. Ava's family, once a source of comfort and support, was now her adversary. Monroe, Sybil, and even Creasa sat across from her, their faces hardened with determination. They weren't just defending themselves, they were attacking her, using every weapon in their legal arsenal to paint her as the villain. "You've made some serious mistakes, Ava," Monroe's lawyer said, his voice smooth and calculated. "You've spent your entire life trusting these people, and now you want to turn your back on them. The truth is, you've never understood the bigger picture. This entire family has worked tirelessly to ensure your well-being, and now you stand here accusing them of malfeasance." The words hit Ava like a slap, but she stood tall, refusing to let them see her falter. She had been groomed for this moment, prepared by the evidence and her own resilience. She knew the family was trying to manipulate the situation, turn the tables, and paint her as the betrayer. It was their last-ditch effort to save themselves. But it wasn't going to work. Not this time. Accusing them of malfeasance. Ava repeated, her voice clear and strong, though the anger simmered just below the surface. I'm not accusing them of anything. I'm telling the truth that they've hidden from me and everyone else for years. They've stolen from me. They've used me. And now they're trying to make me the guilty one. She glanced over at Sybil, who was sitting with her arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. You knew all along, didn't you? Ava continued. You knew I was kept in the dark, that my name was removed from the will, that I was erased from the family legacy. But you didn't care. You just used me to keep the house running while you made sure everything was in your name. Well, I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore. Monroe shot a glance at his lawyer, but Ava could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was trying to maintain control, trying to keep the illusion intact. But Ava had already pierced it. She had already exposed the cracks. Her mind flashed back to the countless moments she had spent in that house, caring for them always at their beck and call, always putting their needs ahead of her own. It was so familiar, so ingrained in her routine. But now she saw it for what it truly was, a manipulation, a set of shackles that had been placed around her without her even realizing. And now that she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Ava looked down at the evidence on the table. The legal documents, the transfer papers, the signed agreements, all of it was irrefutable. But as she prepared to speak again, something within her stopped her. A flash of doubt, a moment of vulnerability. She thought back to when she had first married into the family. At the time, she had thought that her life would be full of love, of shared experiences, of building something meaningful together. She had poured her heart into them, believing that this was her purpose, that this was what it meant to be a part of something greater. But now she realized how wrong she had been. They hadn't wanted her love. They had wanted her labor, her loyalty, her submission. They had never valued her as a person. They had never seen her as a true member of the family. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, pushing the painful thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to be weak, not now. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to let them win. I'm not just fighting for money, Ava said, her voice quieter, but no less determined. I'm fighting for my dignity. I'm fighting for everything you've taken from me, for every moment I've spent feeling invisible, for every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday where I was left behind. You don't get to erase me. You don't get to decide my worth. Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of recognition in the room. Maybe they hadn't expected her to fight back so forcefully. Maybe they had underestimated her. But the doubt that had once clouded Ava's mind was gone. The clarity had replaced it. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. She glanced at Henry sitting quietly in the back of the room. His face was a mixture of pride and sadness, but in his eyes she saw the support she had longed for all her life. He had been the first to stand by her side when everything had fallen apart. He had believed in her when no one else had. And now he was watching as she stood tall in the face of everything that had been stolen from her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Henry, too, for the years he had been manipulated, for the trust that had been broken between them. The pressure to break was real. The stakes were high, and the family's attacks came in waves. Each one meant to push her further into the corner, to make her doubt her every move. Monroe's lawyer was clever. His words sharp as he tried to undermine her confidence, his tone laced with judgment. Ava, he said, you've been so blinded by your own anger that you haven't considered the consequences of your actions. This isn't just about money, is it? You're upset that you were left out. But you're willing to destroy everything for the sake of your own pride. Ava could feel the weight of the words, the pressure to back down, to retreat into the familiar role they had assigned her, to believe that she wasn't worthy of the fight. But she wasn't going to give in. She had spent too many years letting them dictate who she was. It wasn't just about pride. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming her life. No. Ava said, her voice strong, cutting through the lawyer's accusations. It's not about pride. It's about being treated like I matter, like I've always mattered. And you can't take that away from me. But as the case continued to unfold, the emotional toll it took on Ava began to hit her in waves. Every lie, every manipulation, every moment of doubt, all of it was wearing her down. She couldn't help but think back to all those years, to the sacrifices she had made for a family that had never seen her as more than a tool. She had believed that her love was enough, that the sacrifices she made were meaningful. But now, with the truth laid bare, she could see how foolish she had been. The memories hit her hard. The quiet moments when she had tried to convince herself that things would get better, that one day they would see her worth. But they never had. And that was the hardest part. The emotional betrayal stung deeper than anything else. But she couldn't give up now. She couldn't let the past define her future. Ava stood tall once again, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "This is my fight now," she said, her words clear and unwavering. "I'm not going to let you take anything more from me. I will not be invisible anymore." And with that, the battle raged on. But Ava knew she was finally fighting for herself. For the first time in years, she felt like she was on the path to winning. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Ava sat at the table, her back straight, her hands poised over the stack of documents in front of her. Across from her, her family sat a picture of controlled anxiety. They had spent years weaving their web of lies, and now, with every piece of evidence Ava had meticulously gathered, that web was unraveling before their eyes. The judge called the room to order, and Ava's lawyer, Sarah, stood first. The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, Ava could hear nothing but the beat of her own heart. The weight of what was at stake, the battle for her life, her future, and her justice hung in the air. It had all come down to this moment. No more pretending. No more lies. Ava Marin has spent the last several years serving her family, dedicating herself to their needs, while her own identity and rightful inheritance were stripped away. Sarah began, her voice calm but resolute. Today we stand here, not just to correct a wrong, but to hold accountable those who believed they could erase a woman from her own life. Ava's eyes flickered over to her family, Monroe, Sybil, and Creasa. Monroe sat with his arms crossed, his usual confidence now betraying the cracks that had begun to form. Sybil, ever the picture of grace, had her hands neatly folded, her face a mask of indignation. But Ava could see the tension beneath it all. They had underestimated her, and now they were facing the consequences. Sarah continued, and the first piece of evidence was introduced. A series of financial documents, contracts, and legal transfers, all signed and executed without Ava's knowledge. Documents that clearly showed how her name had been erased from the family's wealth, how her rightful inheritance had been transferred under the guise of legal formalities. "This is a document that clearly states the transfer of assets," Sarah said, her finger pointing to the paper. Ava's name crossed out. A document signed by Horace Marin, Ava's father-in-law, authorizing the transfer of all property, business holdings, and family wealth into a trust with no consideration for her as a rightful beneficiary. Ava could hear a faint gasp from her family's side. The evidence was undeniable. She saw Monroe's expression harden, Sybil's jaw tighten, and Creasa shift uncomfortably in her chair. They had no answers now, no way to lie their way out of it. "Your Honor, I have here the original signed contract from Horace Marin," Sarah said, turning to the judge. This contract was filed and processed months before Ava's name was deliberately removed from the family assets. This was not an oversight, it was a calculated, deliberate act. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as the judge leaned forward, taking a moment to process the documents. Ava's heart beat faster, but she held her ground. She had no intention of letting this slip away. Monroe's lawyer stood and immediately objected, trying to cast doubt on the authenticity of the documents, suggesting they could have been forged. But Ava knew this was their final defense, the only way they could try to discredit her case. Ava's own lawyer was ready. "Your Honor, we have expert testimony to verify the authenticity of these documents," Sarah said. "And we have the signature analysis reports that prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these documents were legally executed by the parties involved. These are not forgeries." Monroe's lawyer faltered. The truth was too solid, too damning. There was no escaping it. For the first time, Ava saw the cracks in their defenses. They were no longer in control of the narrative. The truth was now out in the open. And then came the moment that felt like a wave crashing over her Henry's testimony. Ava had been hesitant at first, unsure if his voice would carry the same weight in the courtroom as it did behind closed doors. But as he took the stand, sitting upright in the chair, with a quiet authority, Ava saw that his presence alone was more than enough. Henry's voice cracked slightly, but he spoke with the clarity and conviction of a man who had finally found his courage. "I've watched this family manipulate, lie, and take advantage of Ava for years," he said, his gaze steady. "I was a part of it too, but I've seen the truth now. She's been nothing but loyal to them, and they've treated her like a servant. It's time for that to stop." Ava's heart swelled with gratitude. Henry had always been her ally, even when the rest of the family treated her like an outsider. Now his words were the final piece of the puzzle, proof that this family's lies were not just about money, but about power control and greed. When Henry finished, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. No one spoke for several moments as the weight of his words settled over everyone. Ava knew in that moment that this was the turning point. The family could no longer hide. They could no longer pretend. The final blow came when Ava's lawyer presented the audio recording, the one that had been the catalyst for everything. The recording of Monroe and Sybil, their voices cold and calculating, talking about how they had manipulated her and erased her from the family legacy. The recording played in the courtroom loud and clear. "She's too loyal to question anything," Monroe's voice said. "She'll just keep doing the work and we'll keep taking what's ours. She'll never even notice." The room went still. Ava's family couldn't deny it. There was no way to spin the truth. The recording exposed their manipulation, their lies, and their plan to keep Ava in the shadows forever unseen. Ava sat back, her hands trembling, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. The truth had finally come to light, and her fight was no longer about the past. It was about the future. The family could no longer control her. The judge asked for a recess to review the evidence and deliberate, but Ava knew that this was it, the battle was almost won. As she stood up from her seat, she felt a wave of emotion crash over her. She had fought for this. She had fought for the right to be seen, to be heard, to be treated as an equal. And now, finally, it was happening. She wasn't the maid in their castle anymore. She was Ava, strong, unyielding, and determined to reclaim what was hers. The moment the recess was called, Ava stepped outside the courtroom into the corridor, her legs weak, but her resolve stronger than ever. She leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. The weight of the last few months, the lies, the heartbreak, the constant pressure finally seemed to lift. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time she felt like she could breathe again. And then it hit her. The flood of emotion, the relief, the grief, the anger. It all came rushing in at once, and Ava let the tears fall. This battle had cost her everything, her trust, her faith, her peace of mind. But in the end, it was worth it. The truth had been exposed, and she had taken the first steps toward healing. Her family had pushed her to the edge, but they hadn't broken her. They never would, because Ava was no longer invisible. She was finally free. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet murmur of spectators and the shuffle of papers. Ava stood near the back of the room, her breath held in anticipation. The judge had spent the last hour reviewing the overwhelming evidence presented by her lawyer, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, but she refused to show fear. This was it. This was what she had fought for. "Will the defendant's representatives please stand?" The judge called, his voice clear and commanding. Monroe Sybil and their lawyer stood up, their expressions tight with barely concealed anxiety. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Ava's family, once so powerful and untouchable, now stood on the edge of losing everything. The judge's gaze moved between the defendants and the table where Ava sat, her hands clenched together, still gripping the papers that had once been so painful to her. Now they felt like proof of the strength she had found within herself. She had survived their lies, their manipulation, and today she would see justice done. After reviewing the evidence presented, the judge began, his tone heavy with finality, and considering the testimony provided. "I find that the defendants, including Horace Marin, Monroe Griffin, Sybil Griffin, and Creasa Marin, have engaged in a deliberate and systematic scheme to defraud and manipulate the plaintiff Ava Marin for financial gain. Their actions have caused undue harm and distress, and as a result, I am ordering the immediate seizure of their assets, including, but not limited to, the family estate business holdings and financial portfolios." Ava's heart skipped a beat as the judge's words sank in. Her family was going to lose everything: their wealth, their status, their carefully constructed lives. The realization was both shocking and strangely satisfying. For years they had hidden behind the facade of a perfect family, manipulating her for their own benefit. But now the truth was out, and they would face the consequences. Monroe's face drained of color as the full weight of the judgment hit him. He stood frozen for a moment, eyes wide, unable to speak. Sybil's lips trembled, her expression flickering between fury and disbelief. Creasa looked down, not meeting Ava's gaze. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. But it wasn't just their wealth that was being taken. The emotional toll of their actions was far greater than any financial loss. Ava had spent years questioning her worth, trying to prove herself, believing that if she gave enough, sacrificed enough, she might finally earn their love and respect. But now, it was clear, they had never loved her. They had never seen her as anything but a tool to further their own agenda. The judge's voice cut through her thoughts. Furthermore, the actions of Horace Marin, who was found to be the mastermind behind this operation, have caused irreparable damage to the plaintiff's trust, mental well-being, and financial security. He is hereby removed from any further control over the family estate and will face legal consequences for his role in orchestrating the fraudulent activities. Horace's face twisted with a mix of anger and shame, but he remained silent. Ava had never seen him so vulnerable before, and in that moment, it was as though the man she had once respected had been fully exposed for what he truly was: a manipulator, a deceiver, someone who had used his age and position to control and exploit her. As the judgment was read aloud, Ava felt a wave of relief wash over her. But it wasn't the kind of victory she had expected. She had imagined that when she stood here, when the truth came to light, she would feel triumphant. But instead she felt something else, a deep, hollow ache in her chest. The battle had been won, yes, but it had come at a high price. She had lost something far more precious than money. She had lost the family she thought she had, and the realization was a cold, hard truth she had to face. As the courtroom began to empty, Ava sat still staring at the documents before her. Her lawyer Sarah approached her, face full of quiet satisfaction. "You did it, Ava," Sarah said, her voice filled with admiration. "You stood your ground. Justice has been served." Ava nodded, her mind still processing the enormity of what had just happened. "Justice," she repeated softly. But at what cost? Later that evening, as Ava sat alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had transpired. The case was closed, the verdict was final, and the family's wealth had been seized. Yet Ava felt an emptiness she hadn't expected. The victory didn't feel as sweet as she had imagined. The relief was there, but it was fleeting. She thought back to the years she had spent serving her family, giving everything she had to make them happy, to earn their approval. She had convinced herself that their love was conditional on her sacrifices, that if she did enough, gave enough, she would finally belong. But now the truth was inescapable. She had been used, manipulated, and erased from their lives when they no longer had a need for her. The tears came then, not from anger, but from the slow, aching realization of everything she had lost. Her family, her identity, the life she had imagined, they were all shattered. But in the midst of the pain, Ava realized something important. The battle had never been just about the money. It had been about reclaiming her sense of self, about taking back her life from the people who had stolen it. Ava stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were quiet now, the world moving on, unaware of the war that had just been waged and won in the courtroom. Ava wasn't sure what her future held, but she knew that she was no longer the woman who had been willing to sacrifice herself for the sake of others. She had reclaimed her power, and now it was time to rebuild. The battle was over, but the healing was just beginning. It would take time, she knew that. The emotional scars wouldn't disappear overnight. But she was no longer a victim of her past. She was free. For the first time in years, Ava felt like she could breathe again, and as she stood there looking out at the horizon, she knew that this victory, this freedom, was the real reward. The family she had always dreamed of, it no longer mattered. She was the one who had chosen to stand tall. She was the one who had chosen to fight. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Ava stood at the edge of the small apartment balcony, the wind lightly ruffling her hair as she looked out at the city below. The streets were bustling with life, unaware of the transformation that had taken place in her own life. The past few months had been nothing short of a whirlwind: courtroom battles, betrayal, loss, and finally justice. But now, standing here, there was something else. Something quieter. Something she hadn't anticipated: the beginning of a new chapter. Her family had taken everything from her, but in the process they had unwittingly given her the one thing they could never control: freedom. Ava had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. And now she was determined to build something meaningful, something that could help others who had been through similar struggles. She wasn't just going to exist. She was going to make a difference. The money from the settlement was significant enough to give her a fresh start, to heal the wounds her family had inflicted, and to invest in a future that was hers alone. But Ava knew that money wasn't the real prize. The real victory was the clarity she had gained in the aftermath of the battle. She didn't just want to rebuild her finances. She wanted to rebuild her sense of purpose, to use her experiences to help those who had been left behind like she once had. Ava took the first step by investing in herself. She hired a therapist, someone to help her unpack the years of emotional scars, the manipulation and the sense of unworthiness that had been instilled in her since childhood. The sessions weren't easy. There were moments when she felt like she was drowning in memories, in regrets, in the weight of it all. But slowly, with each conversation, Ava began to piece herself back together. She learned how to forgive herself for the years she had spent trying to please people who didn't deserve her loyalty. She learned to let go of the idea that her worth depended on what others thought of her. In therapy, she also realized that she had a deep desire to help others who were trapped in situations like hers. People who had been silenced, controlled, and erased from their own stories. There were so many others who didn't have the strength to fight back. Ava could give them the tools, the confidence, and the support to do what she had done, take back their power and rebuild their lives. She started by reaching out to local women's shelters, offering her time and resources. She organized self-defense classes, partnering with experts who could teach the skills women needed to feel safe in their own bodies. But it wasn't just about physical defense. Ava knew that emotional and psychological defense were just as important. She began to organize workshops on self-worth, self-empowerment, and setting boundaries. At first, it was just small groups, intimate settings where women could share their stories without fear of judgment. But soon, word spread. More and more women came eager to take control of their lives just as Ava had. The work was exhausting, but it was also deeply rewarding. Ava poured everything she had into these workshops, her passion, her knowledge, and her newfound sense of self. She wanted to be the mentor that she had never had, the role model that she had always needed. The transformation wasn't just external. Ava's financial independence gave her the ability to make choices that reflected her newfound self-worth. She moved into a new home, an apartment she could call her own, decorated with colors and furniture that reflected her personality, her tastes. It was a space that felt like hers, a safe haven away from the pain of the past. But it wasn't just about the physical space. Ava started doing things for herself, things that for years she had put on hold. She took up painting, something she had always wanted to try, but had never found the time for. She enrolled in a yoga class, learning to reconnect with her body in a way she never had before. Slowly, she began to embrace the joy of living for herself without the weight of others' expectations. Even her friendships began to evolve. The few close friends she had during her years of isolation became more than just acquaintances. They became her chosen family. She realized that the relationships she had built outside of her bloodline were far more meaningful than any connection she had ever shared with her family. These friends saw her for who she truly was, not for the role she played in their lives. One evening, after another successful self-defense class, Ava sat at a cafe with Sarah, her lawyer, and one of her closest allies. The conversation had moved from the case to more personal matters, and Ava found herself reflecting on how far she had come. "It's hard to believe," Ava said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in someone else's life. The woman who was manipulated and silenced. She seems so far away now. But I can still feel the echoes of that life, you know, like the shadow of it follows me." Sarah smiled, her eyes warm. "Ava, you're doing more than just surviving. You're thriving. The woman you were that's not who you are anymore. You've become someone who inspires others, who gives them the courage to reclaim their own stories. What you've done, it's incredible." Ava paused, looking out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "I used to think that victory was about taking back what they took from me. But now I realize that victory is about reclaiming my life. All of it. The good, the bad, and everything in between. The power was never in the money or the assets. The power was in choosing to be free." As the months went by, Ava's work with the women's shelters grew. She developed her own nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women rebuild their lives after abuse, whether emotional, financial, or physical. The organization provided resources, mentorship, and self-defense training. It wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about thriving in the future. Ava became a speaker at conferences and events, sharing her story and offering hope to others who had been through similar struggles. She never sugarcoated her journey, but she always emphasized one key message: healing is possible. You don't have to stay stuck in a narrative you didn't write. You can write your own story one page at a time. In her personal life, Ava found a quiet peace. She no longer sought validation from her family or from anyone else. She had learned to trust her own voice, to follow her own path. The pain of the past still lingered in the back of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. She had learned how to coexist with it, how to use it as a stepping stone rather than a shackle. Ava didn't need a perfect life. She didn't need the approval of her family. What she needed was the ability to live authentically, to be true to herself, and to make a difference in the lives of others. And as she stood on the stage at one of her organization's fundraisers, looking out over the crowd of women she had helped, she realized that the woman she had become was everything she had once hoped for. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a force. She was a survivor. She was a leader. Ava's life had come full circle. From the pain of betrayal to the strength of self-discovery, she had built a new life, one that was truly her own. And with every step she took, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Ava sat on the soft cushions of her couch, a cup of tea in her hands, looking out the window at the quiet city street below. The last few years had been a whirlwind, a chaotic storm of betrayal, legal battles, and emotional recovery. But now, in this still moment, there was something different in the air. Something that hadn't been there before peace. For the first time, Ava wasn't haunted by the ghosts of her past. She had spent so long running from the memories of her family's deceit, feeling like they controlled every aspect of her life, that she hadn't realized the power she held to simply let go. Letting go didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing not to let the past dictate her future. And that's exactly what she had done. She had chosen freedom. She had chosen healing. The weight of the past no longer pressed down on her, suffocating her with regret and anger. Ava had learned to forgive herself, not because her family deserved it, but because she deserved to find peace. She had been a prisoner of their manipulation for so long, and now she was free to live on her own terms. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their love. She had come to understand that her worth was not tied to their perception of her, and that realization was more freeing than any legal victory could have been. In her work with the nonprofit, Ava found a sense of purpose that filled the emptiness left by her family's absence. Helping other women rebuild their lives, watching them find their own voices and strength, these moments brought her a deep sense of fulfillment. She didn't just want to heal herself, she wanted to heal the world around her. And in doing so, she found a purpose greater than anything she had ever known before. Every woman she helped, every story shared in her workshops, was a reminder that she wasn't alone, and neither were they. They were all writing their own stories now. But as much as Ava had grown in these last months, there were still moments when the past threatened to creep in. There were nights when she lay awake, her mind racing with questions. Why did they do it? Why didn't they love me the way I loved them? It was hard to quiet those thoughts. The emotional scars of betrayal didn't just vanish because the court ruling had gone in her favor. But Ava had learned to sit with those feelings without letting them consume her. She had come to understand that her pain was valid. but it didn't have to be her identity. She was no longer the victim in her own life story. She had rewritten her narrative, and each day she took another step toward healing. It was a constant process, a journey, not a destination. And with each small victory, Ava found herself letting go of the need for answers. Some questions wouldn't ever be answered, and that was okay. The real question was, what will I do now with the life I've reclaimed? And the answer Ava realized was simple. She would continue to help others. She would continue to find joy in the small, everyday moments that she had once taken for granted. And most importantly, she would learn to love herself again. One day, after a long day of meetings and workshops, Ava sat on the same balcony, the one that had once felt like a prison when she had first moved into the apartment. Now it was a place of solace, a place where she could reflect on how far she had come. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up to see a message from an unexpected source, Monroe. She hesitated before opening it, her heart racing slightly at the thought of hearing from her estranged family after all this time. The message was brief, almost polite. Ava, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out and say that I'm sorry for everything that happened. I don't expect anything from you, but I needed to say it. I understand if you never want to speak to me again. Take care. Ava stared at the words, her breath catching in her chest. The emotion was unexpected, a rush of memories, a mixture of pain and disbelief. For a moment she felt like she was right back in the old house, standing in the kitchen, wondering why she was never enough. But then something shifted inside of her. She didn't feel the anger or the betrayal she had once felt so deeply. Instead, she felt nothing. It wasn't indifference, it was peace. She had long since let go of the need for validation from Monroe Sybil or anyone else in her family. Their actions had shaped her, yes, but they did not define her. Ava put the phone down and let out a slow breath. She had forgiven them long ago, not because they had apologized, but because she needed to. Holding on to that resentment had only kept her chained to a past that was no longer hers to carry. She had made peace with the truth of who they were, and in doing so, she had freed herself. It wasn't just her relationship with her family that had changed. Ava had also started to rebuild relationships with others. She had learned that trust wasn't something to give away freely, but it was something that could be earned, and it could be given back to those who truly deserved it. Her bond with Henry, the man who had been a silent ally throughout her journey, had deepened. Their friendship was no longer just about mutual support. It had become about respect and understanding. They both had scars from the past, but together they had learned to heal, to laugh, and to find joy in the simplest moments. Ava found that her life was richer, fuller, when she allowed herself to trust again, when she allowed herself to feel loved. And then there were the new friendships she had formed, the women she had met through her work, who had become more than just participants. They had become her community. They shared their stories with her, their struggles, their victories. In each of their faces, Ava saw pieces of herself, and in helping them find their strength, she found even more of her own. As months turned into a year, Ava began to see the fruits of her labor. The workshops grew in size, and her nonprofit organization became a beacon of hope for women all over the city. She traveled to other cities to speak at conferences, sharing her story and inspiring others to take control of their own narratives. She wasn't just helping women escape toxic environments anymore. She was empowering them to thrive, to live with confidence and purpose. Ava wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was building something that would last long after she was gone. The women she helped were becoming leaders in their own right, spreading the message of self-love, empowerment, and resilience. And Ava, she had found her peace. She had found her purpose. She had found a life worth living. In the quiet moments when she sat by the window or in the calm of the evening, Ava would look back on everything that had led her to this point. The pain, the struggles, the victories, they were all part of her story. But they no longer defined her. She had learned that the past was a chapter in her life, not the whole book. And now she was writing the next one filled with hope, love, and the kind of peace she had once thought was impossible. Ava's story was her own, and she was finally free to live it on her terms. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed that she was enough. The crash was swift. The downfall of the Griffin family, once untouchable, unfolded in a cascade of bad press legal battles and financial ruin that no one could have predicted. Ava, standing outside the chaos, watched as the empire her family had so carefully built collapsed. Their once pristine reputation, cultivated over decades, began to crumble under the weight of their fraudulent actions. They had used manipulation and deceit to secure their wealth, but in the end, it was the truth that tore it all down. Monroe, Sybil, and Creasa were no longer the powerful figures they once were. The judgment in Ava's favor had been the first blow, but the fallout came quickly and viciously. The once grand mansion they had called home sat empty now, the lavish decor and prestige nothing more than a hollow shell of the lives they had taken for granted. Ava could only imagine the humiliation they must have felt as their property was seized, the bank accounts frozen, and the company, a thriving empire they had fought to control, relinquished to the hands of the courts. It didn't take long for the media to catch wind of the scandal. Articles about the family's fraudulent activities began to flood the headlines. News outlets called them out for their manipulations, their lies, their exploitation of the legal system. They were no longer the respected pillars of society. They were criminals in the eyes of the public. The Griffin family had gone from being a symbol of wealth and power to a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. Monroe had always prided himself on his business acumen, on his ability to outmaneuver competitors and build a fortune from nothing. But now his name was synonymous with fraud. The company that had once been a beacon of success was now under investigation for embezzlement and money laundering. Clients who had trusted Monroe's leadership pulled their contracts, their investments. The firm's stock plummeted, and rumors spread like wildfire. Employees once loyal to the family began to distance themselves, terrified that any association with the Griffins would taint their own careers. And even worse, a series of lawsuits began to mount against them. Ava could see it all unfolding in the news, her family's public disgrace, the headlines blaring their guilt. They had never believed they would get caught, never thought that Ava's quiet rebellion would have consequences beyond her personal life. But now, as their world unraveled, they saw firsthand the true price of their deception. The damage they had done to their own family, to Ava, was far outweighed by the destruction they had brought upon themselves. Sybil, who had once strutted around town like she was untouchable, was now reeling from the accusations. The glamorous image she had cultivated for herself as a lifestyle guru, a successful entrepreneur, was shattered beyond repair. Her brand, built on the idea of rebuilding and personal empowerment, now felt like a cruel joke. She had built a career selling strength and resilience to women, all while secretly manipulating her own daughter-in-law and stealing from her. The truth was too much to bear, and she had no way to spin it back in her favor. The lawsuits that followed were relentless. The legal fees mounted, and the once tight grip the family had on their wealth became a distant memory. Monroe and Sybil tried to fight back, hiring the best lawyers money could buy. but it was clear that no amount of money or influence could save them now. Ava's case had set off a domino effect that they couldn't control. The courts had already ruled, and now the repercussions of their actions were becoming undeniable. Ava couldn't help but watch the slow-motion collapse with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. She had fought for justice, but as she saw her family suffer, she was struck by the overwhelming weight of what had been lost. The victory wasn't as sweet as she had imagined. There were no celebrations. There was only the painful realization that the people she had once loved were now facing the consequences of their greed. For the first time, Ava realized the extent of their betrayal. It wasn't just about the money, the house, or the business. It was about the years of lies, the years of manipulation, and the emotional toll it had taken on her. Her entire life had been a lie, a carefully orchestrated facade, and now she was seeing the truth laid bare. Meanwhile, Ava's family was scrambling to salvage whatever they could, but it was too late. Monroe, who had once prided himself on his control, was now a broken man, clinging to his last vestiges of dignity as the world around him crumbled. Sybil, the once untouchable socialite, found herself facing public humiliation in every corner of her life. Her influence was gone, her connections severed, her reputation shattered. Even Creaser, who had remained silent throughout much of the ordeal, found herself caught in the fallout. Though she had kept her hands relatively clean, it was clear that she too would face consequences for her role in enabling the fraud. The public humiliation was unbearable. The Griffins became the subject of every conversation in town. No one spoke of them with respect anymore. People who had once sought their favor now turned their backs. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances began to distance themselves, afraid of the stigma that had attached itself to the Griffin name. Their empire, so carefully built on secrets and manipulation, had turned into a house of cards, and the winds of scandal had knocked it all down. In a quiet corner of the city, Ava watched it all unfold, not with gloating, but with a quiet acceptance. This was the price they had paid, not just for their greed, but for their cruelty. The family she had once tried so hard to please was now nothing more than a fractured, humiliated group of people, each person left to pick up the pieces of a life they had destroyed. The legal battles continued, but the damage had already been done. Ava, for her part, focused on her work. She had found a new sense of peace, but the events surrounding her family's downfall served as a painful reminder of the cost of her own freedom. Though she no longer had any ties to the Griffins, the scars of the past were never far away. As the weeks went by, Ava's nonprofit work flourished. She had turned the pain of the past into something meaningful, using her experience to help women rebuild their lives. But even in her success, she could never forget the family that had shaped her for better or for worse. They had been the foundation of her journey, and though they had broken her, they had also unknowingly pushed her toward the woman she had become. For the Griffins, however, there was no going back. The consequences of their actions had reverberated through every part of their lives. Their wealth, their status, their company, they had lost it all. And in the process, they had lost something far more important: their integrity, their legacy, and the trust of those who had once believed in them. As Ava continued to build her new life, she couldn't help but feel a bittersweet sorrow for them. They had been her family, but in the end, they had been the architects of their own destruction. And now they would have to face the consequences of the lives they had tried to manipulate for so long. The family that had once seemed so untouchable had fallen crushed beneath the weight of their lies. Ava had found freedom, but at a price. And she knew that the true test of her strength wasn't in the victory she had won in court. It was in her ability to forgive, to rebuild, and to move forward with grace despite the wreckage of her past. She had been broken, yes, but she had also been reborn. Ava stood at the podium, the stage lights shining down on her as the crowd in the auditorium sat in rapt attention. She had become a symbol not just of survival, but of triumph. The road she had walked was not an easy one, but it was one that had led her to this moment, a moment where her story resonated with women everywhere. Her journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption had become a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced, dismissed, and taken advantage of. Her story had begun with one woman, a quiet figure in the background of a wealthy family, unnoticed and unappreciated. But it had transformed into a narrative of resistance, of reclaiming power, of finding strength in the most unexpected places. Ava had gone from being the invisible woman in her family to being a leader, a warrior, and most importantly, a symbol of hope for all women who had ever felt powerless. Across the country, women who had experienced similar betrayals from their own families, who had been manipulated, abused, or taken for granted, began to look to Ava for inspiration. Her fight wasn't just for herself, it was for all of them. It was a fight for every woman who had ever been told that she wasn't enough, for every woman whose voice had been silenced, for every woman who had been forced to play a role in someone else's story. As Ava looked out at the sea of faces before her, she saw their eyes locked on her, their hope mirrored in her own. They were waiting for her to speak, to share her story, to tell them how she had done it, how she had escaped the shadows and found the light. And she did. "I was once just like you," Ava began, her voice steady yet full of the emotion she had carried for so long. "I was silent, invisible, and I thought that was all I would ever be. I thought my worth was tied to my ability to serve, to sacrifice, to be the person everyone else needed me to be. But I was wrong. My worth is not defined by what others want from me. My worth is defined by what I choose to do with my life, by how I choose to fight for myself." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Ava could feel the weight of the moment, the importance of it. This wasn't just a speech, it was a lifeline. For many in that room, it was the first time they had heard someone speak so honestly about the pain they had lived through, about the trauma that had shaped their lives. And Ava wasn't just speaking to them, she was showing them that they too could break free. "I fought back." Ava continued, her voice gaining strength. "Not just for myself, but for every woman who has ever felt invisible. Every woman who has been manipulated, taken for granted, or told that her worth is nothing more than what she can give. You are not just a reflection of someone else's needs. You are powerful, you are worthy, and you deserve to live a life that is yours." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that filled Ava's heart with a warmth she had never known before. It was a moment of validation, not for her, but for the countless women who had stood behind her, who had listened to her words, and who now saw their own worth in her story. After the speech, Ava found herself surrounded by women, many of whom she had never met, coming up to her, tears in their eyes, gratitude in their voices. They were the ones who had heard her call and responded. They were the ones who had listened to her journey and had found the courage to begin their own. In the sea of women who surrounded her, Ava saw fragments of herself, the quiet, invisible woman who had been afraid to speak up, afraid to stand tall. But now she saw something else, a reflection of strength, resilience, and a shared journey toward empowerment. One woman in particular approached her with a trembling voice. "You don't know how much your story has helped me," she said. "I've been in an abusive relationship for years and I thought I couldn't leave. But hearing you speak, I finally feel like I have the strength to walk away." Ava placed her hand on the woman's shoulder, looking into her eyes with a warmth that said everything she couldn't put into words. You already have the strength, Ava said softly. It's been inside you all along. I'm just here to remind you that you don't have to do it alone. The woman smiled through her tears, and Ava realized in that moment that this was the real victory, the lives she was helping to change, the hearts she was inspiring to heal. It wasn't the money, the fame, or the recognition. It was the impact she was making on the world around her, and that was worth more than anything she could have ever imagined. Ava's nonprofit work had flourished, and she had expanded her efforts beyond just local workshops. She had become a sought-after speaker at national conferences, a figurehead in the movement for women's empowerment. She continued to run her self-defense programs, but now they were complemented by educational sessions on financial independence, emotional resilience, and mental health. Ava had come to understand that true empowerment wasn't just about learning to fight physically, it was about learning to fight for yourself, to demand respect, and to stand up for your worth in every aspect of your life. Her work began to intersect with larger advocacy groups, and soon she was collaborating with legislators to create better protections for women facing financial abuse and manipulation. She used her own story as a catalyst for systemic change, working tirelessly to ensure that no woman would ever have to endure what she had. Ava found herself in meetings with women who had been at the top of their fields, successful in ways she had never imagined, but who still carried the invisible scars of manipulation and control. They came to her for guidance, for strength, for the courage to face their own battles. And with every woman she helped, Ava grew more confident in her own journey. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a leader, a mentor, and a voice for those who had none. As the years passed, Ava's influence only grew. But the most rewarding part of her journey was not the recognition or the accolades, it was the quiet moments when she saw the fruits of her labor. The women who had once been afraid, who had once felt hopeless, now stood tall and proud, leading their own lives with confidence and self-respect. Ava knew she had made a difference, but she also knew the journey would never be over. Empowerment wasn't a destination, it was a lifelong commitment. And as long as there were women who needed her, she would keep fighting, keep speaking, and keep showing them that their voices mattered. Her story was no longer just her own. It had become the story of all the women who had found their strength in her words, in her example, and in her unwavering belief that they too could rewrite their narratives. Ava was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She was the woman who had fought for her freedom, and in doing so had become a symbol of hope, courage, and the power of reclaiming one's life. Ava sat on the edge of her balcony, the city sprawled before her in a patchwork of lights and shadows. The sun had just set, and a cool breeze stirred the air. It was a simple moment, but to Ava it felt like the culmination of everything she had fought for. She had spent years running from the past, trying to erase the pain, the betrayal, and the anger that had consumed her for so long. But now, as she gazed out at the horizon, she realized that the peace she had been searching for had finally arrived, not in some grand victory, but in this quiet, unspoken acceptance. For the first time in years, Ava wasn't haunted by the memories of her family's betrayal. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined her. They no longer held power over her emotions, her thoughts, or her actions. The court battles, the lies, the manipulation. They were all part of her story now, but they were no longer the chapters that dictated who she was. She had learned to let go not of the memories, but of the pain that had been tied to them. Ava had reclaimed her life piece by piece. She had transformed her suffering into strength, her silence into a voice that resonated with thousands of women. But even more than that, she had found something she hadn't known she was missing: peace. She no longer needed to look over her shoulder to wonder if she was still the same invisible woman she had been in the past. She was free, truly free, and that freedom gave her a sense of serenity that nothing else could. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had endured and everything she had achieved. The journey had been long, and it had taken her to places she never thought she would go. But as she sat there in this moment of calm, Ava knew that the hardest part was over. The healing was not instantaneous, and it had come with its share of struggle, but she had finally arrived at a place where she could look back with gratitude for the lessons, not bitterness for the betrayal. Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, and a small smile crept across her face as she saw a message from Sarah, her closest friend and ally through it all. "How are you feeling today? Are you ready for the fundraiser tomorrow? I know it's a big step for the nonprofit, but we've come so far. You've come so far." Ava's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she typed back, "I'm feeling good, Sarah. I've never felt more at peace. I'm ready for what comes next. I'm ready to take the next step." It had taken Ava years to get to this point, years of fighting, healing, and rebuilding her life. But now she felt whole. The scars were part of her, yes, but they were no longer the focal point of her existence. They had been woven into the fabric of who she was, but they no longer controlled her, and that was the most empowering feeling of all. The next day, Ava stood in front of a room full of supporters at the annual fundraiser for her nonprofit. The lights were dimmed, the room filled with the buzz of quiet conversations and the hum of excited energy in the air. Ava had seen how much the organization had grown in the last few years. What started as a small community initiative was now a movement, a lifeline for women who needed it most. As she stepped up to the podium, she looked out over the faces in the crowd. She recognized some from the workshops, some from the legal battles, and many she had never met, but had helped through her work. Each one of them was a part of her story now, a reflection of her own journey. Ava cleared her throat, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She had spoken in front of crowds many times before, but today something was different. Today she wasn't just speaking about her mission. She was speaking from the core of who she was, a woman who had been broken, but had learned to rebuild herself piece by piece. "Thank you all for being here." Ava began, her voice steady and clear. "When I started this journey, I didn't know where it would take me. I didn't know what it would cost me or what I would lose along the way. But what I've gained has been something I never could have imagined: peace. Peace in knowing that my story isn't defined by what was done to me. My story is defined by how I choose to live from this point forward." She paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle in the room. "I know there are many of you here today who have your own stories. Stories of struggle, of survival, of overcoming obstacles that seemed impossible to get through. But I want you to know this: you are not alone. And your story doesn't have to end with the pain. It doesn't have to end with the betrayal. You are so much more than what you've been through. You are powerful, and you can choose to rise just like I did." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air, but there was a soft murmur of recognition, of solidarity. Ava felt her heart swell with gratitude as she realized just how far her message had traveled. It wasn't just about reclaiming her own life, it was about giving others the tools to do the same. That evening, as the event came to a close, Ava found herself surrounded by women, new faces, familiar faces, faces that had been touched by her story. They shared their own journeys with her, their struggles and their triumphs. Many of them had never had the courage to speak out before, but here in this room, they had found the strength to do so. And that, Ava realized, was the most meaningful part of it all. Her heart felt full. She had helped them find their voices just as she had found hers. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned, Ava sat quietly in the back office, her hand wrapped around a cup of tea. She thought about how far she had come from the woman who had once felt invisible to the woman who now stood as a beacon of hope for so many others. Her phone buzzed again this time with a text from her therapist, someone who had walked with her through every difficult moment of her journey. "You've come so far, Ava. I hope you take a moment to recognize all that you've achieved. You've created something beautiful from your pain, and that is something worth celebrating." Ava read the message and smiled, her heart full. She had done it. She had built something that mattered. More than that, she had built herself. The next few months passed in a blur of speaking engagements, workshops, and community outreach. Ava's nonprofit continued to grow, expanding to new cities, reaching more women who needed the same help she had once needed. But in the midst of all the work, Ava took time to breathe, to savor the moments of quiet that came at the end of long days, to find joy in the little things, a cup of coffee with friends, a walk through the park, an evening spent reading in her favorite chair. And it was in those quiet moments that she realized something profound. She had not only found peace within herself, she had found peace in her relationships as well. Her friendships had deepened. Her connection with her chosen family had strengthened. She had finally allowed herself to trust again, to open her heart without fear of being hurt. The love she had once sought from her family was now coming from the people who truly mattered, those who had stood by her, supported her, and loved her for who she was, not what she could do for them. Ava had learned to love herself, to embrace her own worth, and to let go of the toxic ties that had once held her captive. And in doing so, she had opened herself up to a future filled with the love, peace, and joy she had always deserved. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a woman who had found her way back to herself, and that was the greatest victory of all. As she stood on the balcony once more looking out at the night sky, Ava whispered softly to herself, "I'm free. I'm finally free." And with that, she knew she had reached the end of one journey and the beginning of another, a journey where she would continue to create, inspire, and live with purpose, knowing that her life was now her own, to live with peace and love as her guide. The early morning sunlight streamed through the curtains of Ava's apartment, casting long, soft shadows on the floor. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her jacket, her hands steady, but her heart racing. It had been a long time since she had looked at herself this way, with confidence, with purpose, with the unwavering belief that she could face whatever came next. The woman who once cowered in the shadows of her family's lies was no more. In her place stood someone strong, someone who had learned how to stand tall in the face of adversity. Ava took one last look at her reflection, her eyes now filled with something new hope. She wasn't looking back at the woman who had been a victim. She was looking at the woman who had fought for her own future, who had made peace with her past, and was now moving forward unburdened. The scars of her journey were there, but they no longer held power over her. Instead, they were a testament to her resilience, to her strength. They were reminders of how far she had come and how much further she could go. As Ava walked out of her apartment and into the sunlight, the weight of her past lifted. She no longer felt the pull of her family's manipulation, no longer feared the ghosts of the people who had used and betrayed her. The past was just that, a chapter in her story, not the whole book. She had turned the page, and now she was writing the next part of her life, one that was filled with freedom, empowerment, and the promise of a new beginning. She stepped out into the busy street, the sound of the city enveloping her, the hum of conversations, the rustle of leaves in the trees, the rhythmic footsteps of people going about their day. Ava wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. She was a woman with a purpose, walking with her head held high, her steps firm and confident. The city with its energy and its chaos no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a canvas waiting for her to make her mark. Ava had learned to let go of the fear that had once defined her. Fear of rejection. Fear of not being good enough. Fear of the unknown. She had faced the worst of what life could throw at her, and she had emerged from it stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The lessons of the past were now stepping stones to her future, not chains holding her back. As she made her way down the sidewalk, she passed a group of women who smiled at her, a knowing look in their eyes. These were the women she had helped, the women she had guided toward their own strength. They had come to her in search of hope, and now they were walking their own paths, their heads held high just as she had learned to do. Ava knew she had given them something that could never be taken away, the belief in themselves. The sound of her phone vibrating in her pocket broke the peaceful rhythm of her walk. She pulled it out and saw a message from Sarah, her closest friend and ally. "I'm so proud of you, Ava. You've come so far. I know this is just the beginning for you. What's next?" Ava smiled softly as she typed her reply. "The next chapter. Sarah. A future built on my own terms, and a future full of possibilities." She could feel the weight of the words not just as a message to Sarah, but as a declaration to herself. The future was wide open, and for the first time in her life, Ava knew that she had the power to shape it. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She wasn't asking for approval. She was moving forward one step at a time with confidence and strength. As Ava continued walking through the city, she thought about everything she had been through. The battles, the betrayals, the moments of doubt and fear. But now those moments felt distant. They were no longer the defining moments of her life. The defining moments were the choices she had made in the aftermath, the decision to reclaim her power to help others to build something that was hers and hers alone. She thought about the women who had come to her for help, who had trusted her with their stories, their pain, their fears. They had found courage in her words, and she had found courage in theirs. Together, they were building a community, a sisterhood of women who supported one another, who lifted each other up, who refused to be silenced. And as Ava walked through the streets of the city, she realized something. The city wasn't just her canvas. It was theirs, too. It was a place where all of them could stand tall, where their voices could be heard, where they could shape their own futures. Ava was no longer alone. She was part of something larger, something that would continue to grow, continue to empower, continue to change the world. Later that evening, Ava sat in her favorite chair, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light on the room. She had just finished an inspiring meeting with a new group of women who had come to join her nonprofit, eager to give back to others. They were so full of hope, so full of life, and Ava could feel that energy that reminded her of who she had been, but also of who she had become. For the first time in years, Ava felt a profound sense of peace. She had come through the storm, and now she was standing in the calm. Her work wasn't done, but she knew that the road ahead was one she was ready to walk. With every woman she helped, with every new chapter she wrote, Ava felt her own story unfolding in ways she had never imagined. As the evening wore on, Ava stood by the window looking out at the city. The stars were beginning to appear twinkling in the vast expanse of the night sky. She thought about the journey she had taken from the quiet, invisible woman she once was to the leader she had become. She thought about the future, a future full of possibilities and opportunities, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything she had learned along the way. Ava was no longer bound by the chains of her past. She had broken free, and in doing so she had found something more precious than anything money or status could offer. She had found herself. and with that discovery she knew that the best was yet to come. The story ends, but Ava's journey is far from over. She looks toward the horizon, her heart full of hope, her spirit unbreakable. There is so much more to come, so many lives to touch, so many women, to inspire so many stories to tell. Ava is ready, and she walks forward with strength, purpose, and the unshakable belief that she has the power to create the life she deserves. The future is hers to shape, and as she takes that first step into it, Ava knows that anything is possible. The end, but also just the beginning.